I, Jessica, 34 years old, still remember how my husband's words cut through me like a knife at that expensive restaurant. I'm taking separate vacations from now on. You're boring, he announced between sips of his $200 wine. My heart shattered as he continued. You're dragging me down. I sat frozen, humiliated, as nearby diners pretended not to hear. What he didn't know was this. His cruel words would be the beginning of his end. Boring? I'd show him exactly what that word really means. Before I share this wild journey, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have valued you. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. David and I were college sweethearts. We met during sophomore year in the campus library when we both reached for the same economics textbook. It was such a cliché moment, but it felt magical then. His blue eyes crinkled when he smiled, offering to share the book. That night, we studied together until the library closed, and by the end of the semester, we were inseparable. Our wedding came 5 years later, a simple but elegant ceremony with 80 guests at his parents' backyard in Connecticut. I can still picture the fairy lights strung through the oak trees, the white tent billowing gently in the summer breeze, and David's face as I walked down the aisle. That day, he called me his forever adventure partner. The irony of that title would only become apparent years later. The first 3 years of our marriage were genuinely happy. We bought a small starter home in the suburbs, adopted a rescue dog named Baxter, and spent weekends exploring hiking trails or trying new restaurants. David worked as a junior executive at a tech firm, while I built my career as a marketing coordinator. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable and, more importantly, connected. Everything changed when David received his big promotion to VP of Product Development. Suddenly, our modest lifestyle wasn't enough. The hiking boots were replaced with golf clubs. The local bistros exchanged for restaurants where entrees cost more than our weekly grocery budget. His wardrobe underwent an overnight transformation: designer suits, expensive watches, the works. I supported his success, of course. I was proud of him. When his new position required relocating to Seattle, I left my job without hesitation. It was my second career sacrifice for his advancement, having previously abandoned a promising position in Chicago 3 years earlier for his first promotion. Each time, I told myself it was an investment in our shared future. In Seattle, David's transformation accelerated. He started staying late at work, first occasionally, then regularly. Our standing Friday date nights were canceled more often than not. Networking opportunities, he'd explain with an apologetic smile that became less apologetic as months passed. He forgot our 5th anniversary entirely, sending a generic bouquet of roses the next day with a text that read, "Sorry, crazy at work. Make it up to you this weekend?" We never did. His new friends were all from the executive circle, people with vacation homes and private school discussions. During the rare dinners I attended with them, I felt increasingly invisible. David would interrupt my stories or give me looks when I mentioned our college days or made references to TV shows I enjoyed. Later, he'd critique my outfit choices or suggest I update my cultural references. I started dreading these social gatherings, the knot in my stomach tightening with each one. I wasn't blind to what was happening, but I was determined to save our marriage. I signed up for cooking classes to prepare the sophisticated meals he now preferred. I refreshed my wardrobe, stretching our budget to accommodate designer labels I didn't care about. I tried developing interests in jazz and wine tasting, subjects he suddenly claimed had always fascinated him, though I'd never heard him mention either during our first 5 years together. Despite my efforts, the distance between us grew. I'd reach for his hand during movies, and he'd pull away to check emails. My questions about his day were met with one-word answers, while he'd spend hours on the phone with colleagues. Nights when he actually came home for dinner became special occasions rather than normal life. The insecurities crept in slowly, then all at once. I started questioning everything: my appearance, my intelligence, my personality. Was I too predictable? Not ambitious enough? In the mirror, I no longer recognized the confident woman David had fallen in love with in college. I had become a shadow, constantly trying to reshape myself to fit his evolving expectations. The first concrete betrayal happened on a rainy Tuesday. David had left his laptop open while showering before a business dinner. A message notification popped up from someone named Melissa. "Can't wait to see you tonight." Just us this time? I shouldn't have looked. But after months of intuition screaming that something was wrong, I clicked. What I found was worse than evidence of physical cheating. It was a conversation thread with this colleague where they discussed how basic I was becoming. "She just doesn't fit with where I'm headed," David had written. "Everything about her screams suburban mediocrity." When I confronted him, showing the messages, he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "You went through my private conversations?" he deflected. "That's a complete invasion of privacy, Jessica." Somehow, I became the villain for discovering his betrayal rather than him being accountable for his cruelty. He dismissed the messages as venting and work stress. Like a fool, I accepted his non-apology, convinced that if I just tried harder, we could find our way back. Looking back, I should have left then. But 7 years of marriage, the memories of who we once were, and the fear of starting over kept me trying long after the relationship had fundamentally broken. Our 7th anniversary arrived on a crisp October evening. Despite everything, I felt hopeful. Anniversaries had always been sacred to us, even during rough patches. David had actually made the reservation himself at Lumiere, the most exclusive French restaurant in the city with a 3-month waiting list. Surely, I thought, this was his way of reconnecting, of showing me I still mattered. I spent the entire day preparing. I visited a salon for the first time in months, splurging on a haircut and style that took years off my appearance. The black dress I bought cost more than I'd ever spent on a single item of clothing, a fitted designer piece that made me feel beautiful again. Standing in our bedroom, putting on the pearl earrings David had given me for our first anniversary, I practiced smiling in the mirror, rehearsing light-hearted stories that wouldn't bore him. David arrived home to change just 30 minutes before our reservation, barely glancing at my transformation. "You look nice," he said absently, eyes on his phone as he loosened his tie. The compliment felt like an afterthought, something socialized into him rather than a genuine reaction. Still, I held on to hope as we drove downtown. Lumiere was everything its reputation promised: intimate lighting from authentic crystal chandeliers, staff that materialized exactly when needed and disappeared otherwise, and a wine list thicker than some novels I'd read. We were seated at a corner table with a stunning view of the Seattle skyline. The setting was perfect for reconnection, for remembering why we chose each other. From the beginning, though, something felt off. David kept checking his watch and phone, responding to work emails between courses. His attention drifted during my carefully prepared anecdotes about a project I was excited about at my new marketing job. When I asked about his week, he gave perfunctory responses, none of the details or humor that had once characterized our conversations. The breaking point came after our main course, as the waiter cleared our plates. I reached across the table for David's hand, suggesting a weekend getaway to the mountain cabin we used to love. His response froze me in place. "Actually, I've been meaning to talk to you about something," he said, withdrawing his hand to reach for his wine glass. "I'm planning to take vacations separately from now on." I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I need space, Jessica. Time away. On my own terms." He took a sip of wine, studying the glass rather than meeting my eyes. "You and I want different things from travel. You're content with hiking trails and reading on the porch. I want experiences, adventure. We can do those things together," I suggested, my voice smaller than I intended. "I'm open to trying new—" "That's just it," he interrupted. "You're boring, Jessica." "There, I've said it. Being with you is like wearing a weighted vest while I'm trying to climb. Everything is more difficult, less exciting. You're dragging me down." The brutal words hung in the air between us. At a nearby table, a woman quickly looked away when I glanced in her direction. They had heard. Of course they had heard. "I've booked a trip to Bali next month," he continued, seemingly oblivious to my shock and the attention of nearby diners. "The team from the Singapore office invited me to join them for some island hopping afterward. High-end resorts, private boats. The kind of experience I need at this stage of my career." I felt physically ill. My heart raced so fast I could hear it pounding in my ears. The restaurant suddenly seemed too warm. The intimate lighting now just insufficient air circulation. The $65 sea bass I'd eaten threatened to reappear. "Are you going with Melissa?" The question escaped before I could stop it. For the first time that evening, I had his full attention. A flash of something guilt? Anger? Crossed his face. This isn't about anyone else. It's about what I need. My own space to grow without constantly worrying about whether you're having a good time or feeling included. Somehow, I maintained composure through dessert, which neither of us ate, and the drive home. Not a single word was exchanged in the car. David turned on NPR, filling the silence with a discussion about interest rates that neither of us cared about. I stared out the window, watching Seattle's lights blur through tears. I refused to let fall. At home, David immediately retreated to his home office while I locked myself in our bathroom, finally allowing the sobs to come. I sat on the cold tile floor, still in my expensive dress, crying until my throat hurt and my eyes swelled. Through the wall, I could hear David on a phone call, laughing about something, as if he hadn't just shattered my world hours earlier. Around midnight, I crept into his office, needing answers the way a dying person needs oxygen. His laptop was closed but not locked. He'd grown careless with his passwords around me. So confident I wouldn't look again after the last confrontation. Part of me didn't want to know, but a stronger part needed truth more than comfort. What I found turned my anguish to ice. His trip to Bali wasn't a recent decision. He'd booked the flights 3 months ago, around the time he'd made our anniversary dinner reservation. The resort confirmation showed a luxury ocean villa with sunset views. The cost for just the accommodation was nearly our monthly mortgage payment. There were emails coordinating the trip with colleagues, including Melissa, whose messages had become increasingly personal. But what truly broke me was finding a folder labeled Next Steps containing research on apartments in our area, as well as a consultation appointment with a divorce attorney scheduled for the week after his return from Bali. He wasn't just taking a separate vacation. He was preparing to leave me. I returned to our bedroom where David slept soundly, untroubled by either his cruelty or his deceit. Looking at his peaceful face, I experienced a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The man I loved was gone, perhaps had been gone for longer than I'd admitted to myself. In his place was someone who could wound me deeply and then sleep without remorse. That night, staring at the ceiling, I reached rock bottom. Then, in the strange calm that sometimes follows complete emotional collapse, I began to think clearly about what would come next. The following morning was surreal. David woke up, kissed my cheek, and proceeded with his routine as if the previous night had never happened. He made his specialty weekend coffee, whistling as he ground the expensive beans he ordered from some small batch roaster in Portland. "I was thinking we could try that new brunch place today," he said casually, sliding a mug across the counter to me. I stared at him, wondering if I had hallucinated the entire dinner conversation. "After what you said last night? About me being boring and dragging you down?" He had the audacity to look annoyed. "I thought we moved past that. It was just an honest conversation about vacation preferences, Jessica. Don't be so sensitive." His dismissal of my feelings wasn't new, but my willingness to accept it was gone. While he showered, I returned to his laptop. This time, I wasn't looking for evidence of his betrayal. I was searching for the full scope of it. The credit card statements were the first revelation. For over a year, David had been making purchases that never appeared in our joint accounts, dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of, gifts from jewelry stores, weekend hotel charges in nearby Portland and Vancouver. He'd opened a separate credit card without my knowledge, paying it from an account I didn't have access to. His email revealed the second layer of deceit. Behind the account I knew existed was another, linked to his phone but not his laptop, which he'd apparently forgotten to log out of. Here were the travel itineraries for business trips that were actually vacations: a long weekend in Napa, a ski trip to Aspen, a 5-day stay in Miami. In the photos attached to these emails, the same woman appeared repeatedly: Melissa, his colleague, looking progressively more comfortable at his side. What had begun as a professional relationship had clearly evolved. The timestamps on these trips correlated perfectly with his most distant periods in our marriage. Times when he'd been swamped with work and sleeping at the office to meet deadlines. As my investigation deepened, I remembered my old college friend Rachel, who now worked in digital forensics for a security firm. We'd drifted apart during my marriage, another relationship David had subtly discouraged, but I still had her number. Jess. It's been forever. Her genuine delight at hearing from me made me realize how isolated I'd become. Over coffee that afternoon, while David was at his squash game, which I now doubted existed, Rachel helped me recover deleted messages and access cloud storage I didn't even know David had been using. What we found confirmed my worst suspicions. David and Melissa had been involved for nearly 2 years, their relationship evolving from flirtation to a full-blown affair. "I'm so sorry, Jess," Rachel said, squeezing my hand across the table. "No one deserves this." But the betrayal went beyond the emotional. The financial discoveries were equally devastating. David had been systematically moving money from our joint savings into private accounts, building a financial cushion while leaving our shared accounts with just enough to maintain appearances. The investments he'd mentioned were real, but they were in his name only, despite using our joint funds as capital. "You need to talk to a lawyer," Rachel advised. "Like, tomorrow." She connected me with her friend Emma, a family law attorney who agreed to meet me on Monday. Emma's assessment was blunt after reviewing the evidence I'd gathered. "He's been planning this exit for a while," she confirmed. "The good news is he's been sloppy. The separate accounts, the hidden assets courts don't look kindly on this kind of financial infidelity." As we discussed my options, an unexpected piece of the puzzle fell into place. Emma mentioned something about intellectual property in the context of marriage assets, which triggered a memory. 2 weeks earlier, David had left presentation materials open on our home printer slides for a product innovation he was presenting to the board. The concepts had seemed familiar, but I couldn't place why. That evening, I dug through old emails from my previous job and found what I was looking for. The innovation David was presenting as his own had striking similarities to a project my former colleague Miguel had pitched before being denied funding and subsequently leaving the company. The same company where David was now a VP. I reached out to Miguel with a carefully worded message, asking about his old project without revealing my suspicions. His response confirmed everything. David had taken Miguel's detailed proposal, which Miguel had shared during a consultant interview that didn't pan out, and was now developing it as his own brainchild, with no credit or compensation to Miguel. This wasn't just personal betrayal anymore. This was potentially corporate theft and fraud. My research into intellectual property laws and corporate ethics policies occupied the next few days. I learned about the serious consequences for this kind of misconduct: termination, legal action, industry blacklisting. David's company had specific, strict policies about intellectual property, attribution, and ethical conduct, all of which he appeared to be violating. What had started as a mission to protect myself during an inevitable divorce was evolving into something more complex. I wasn't interested in revenge for its own sake. Destroying David wouldn't heal the pain he'd caused. But justice, accountability, those I could pursue with clear conscience. I began developing a comprehensive plan, methodically organizing evidence and establishing a timeline. The anger that had initially driven me was cooling into something more powerful: strategic determination. David had underestimated me for years, dismissed me as boring and basic. He hadn't recognized that my attention to detail, my patience, and my thoroughness, qualities he'd come to mock, were about to become his undoing. "You seem different," David remarked over dinner, a week after the devastating restaurant conversation. He studied me with mild curiosity, like I was a slightly altered piece of furniture. I smiled and took a sip of wine. "Do I?" My calm demeanor clearly confused him. He'd expected tears, pleading, perhaps more confrontation about his Bali plans. Instead, I'd spent the week moving purposefully, speaking less but more confidently when I did speak. "About the Bali trip," he said cautiously, "I've been thinking maybe we could plan something for you too. Maybe a spa weekend with your sister while I'm gone?" The condescension was breathtaking. A spa weekend versus his 10-day luxury island excursion. "Actually, I've made my own plans," I replied. I've signed up for that photography workshop I mentioned last year. The one you said was a waste of money. Photography had been my passion in college, another part of myself. I'd minimized to accommodate David's growing ego. The surprise on his face was worth every penny of the workshop fee I'd already paid. Photography? Since when are you back into that? I never stopped being interested. I just stopped talking about it. I served myself more salad, enjoying his confusion. I also reconnected with Rachel and Miguel this week. It's been nice catching up with old friends. The mention of Miguel's name caused a nearly imperceptible flinch. Good. He should be nervous. Miguel, from your old job? Why would you contact him? I shrugged. We always had great creative energy together. He's doing amazing work in his new role. Over the next few days, I continued my strategic transformation. I opened a separate bank account, gradually transferring small amounts that wouldn't trigger David's attention. I documented every financial record I could access, creating a secure digital trail of evidence for the eventual divorce proceedings. The call from David's mother came unexpectedly on Thursday evening while he was at a networking event, which his location history, synced to our home iPad, showed was actually at a hotel downtown. Jessica, honey, is everything all right between you and David? Diane's concern seemed genuine. We'd always had a good relationship, even as David grew more distant from his parents, finding them too provincial for his new image. Why do you ask? I kept my tone neutral, unsure how much to reveal. He's been making strange comments lately. Said he might take a position in the Singapore office next year. Mentioned selling the house. She paused. He hasn't mentioned any of this to you, has he? My heart sank. Another layer of betrayal. Plans to move overseas without even discussing it with me. No, Diane, he hasn't. Our conversation lasted over an hour. I carefully shared selected truths. David's increasing criticism, his separate vacation plans, his growing distance. I didn't mention the affair or the financial deception, not wanting to devastate her completely, but I said enough that she understood the marriage was in serious trouble. I always worried about this, she admitted. When he got that big promotion, he changed. Started talking like his father before the divorce. Her voice cracked slightly. I love my son, but he's making the same mistakes his father did. By the time we hung up, I had an unexpected ally. Diane promised to come visit after David's Bali trip, ostensibly to check on the garden she'd helped us plant, but really to offer support. As the date of David's departure approached, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. My new confidence clearly unsettled him. He'd grown accustomed to my accommodation, my constant effort to please. Now, as I focused on my photography, spent evenings with reconnected friends, and responded to his criticisms with calm indifference, he struggled to regain control. You're acting strange, he accused the night before his flight. Is this some kind of game to make me feel guilty about Bali? Not everything is about you, David, I replied, continuing to edit photos from my workshop. I'm just focusing on things that make me happy. His expression shifted between confusion, irritation, and something approaching alarm. The power dynamic he'd carefully constructed over years was showing its first cracks. The morning of his departure, I drove him to the airport. He spent most of the ride on work calls, barely acknowledging me. At the terminal, he gave me a perfunctory kiss. Try not to be too bored while I'm gone, he said with a smirk that no longer had the power to wound me. Oh, I'll keep busy, I assured him with a smile that should have warned him. Have a wonderful trip. You deserve exactly what's coming to you. He took it as a kind wish rather than the promise it was, waving distractedly as he rolled his luggage toward the terminal. I watched him disappear into the airport, knowing that the man who returned 10 days later would be facing a very different wife and a very different future than the one he was so casually leaving behind. As I pulled away from the curb, a weight lifted. The real work was just beginning. The moment David's flight status showed departed, I began implementing the plan I'd meticulously developed. My first call was to the ethics department at his company, using the anonymous reporting line I'd found on their corporate website. I have evidence of intellectual property theft and potential fraud by a senior executive, I stated, keeping my voice steady despite my racing heart. I provided just enough specific details about Miguel's stolen project to trigger an investigation without revealing my identity. Next, I contacted Miguel directly, no longer hiding my suspicions. "I believe my husband stole your work and is presenting it as his own," I told him bluntly. "I have documentation to prove it." Miguel's initial shock gave way to controlled anger. "I always wondered why that interview went nowhere, despite everyone seeming impressed," he said. "They ghosted me right after I shared my full presentation materials with David. I sent him copies of the presentation I'd found, and he confirmed my suspicions, the core concepts, implementation strategy, and even some of the market analysis were directly lifted from his work. With his permission, I forwarded his original materials and timestamp evidence to the company's investigation team. While these professional dominoes began to fall, I focused on protecting myself financially. With Emma's guidance, I documented every hidden account I'd discovered and prepared the necessary paperwork for divorce proceedings. We scheduled the filing for the day after David's return. I wanted to face him directly rather than have him served while out of the country. "He's been moving money for months," I explained to Emma as we reviewed the financial evidence. "Classic preparation for divorce, right?" "Exactly," she confirmed. "And doing it badly. Judges hate this kind of financial shell game." With Rachel's help, I copied all evidence of the affairs and financial deceit, securing it in multiple locations. "If he realizes what's happening, he might try to destroy evidence," Rachel warned. "Make sure you have backups of backups." On day 3 of David's trip, I changed the locks on our home office. Not the main house that would be legally problematic, but the separate office where he stored his most sensitive work materials. A locksmith friend of Rachel's made it look identical to the original, but with a different key. The most delicate part of my plan involved David's immediate boss, Thomas, the executive VP who had always been friendly to me at company functions. I requested a meeting, positioning it as a surprise for David's upcoming birthday. Thomas welcomed me warmly into his office. "David's lucky to have such a thoughtful wife," he said as his assistant brought us coffee. "Actually, Thomas, this isn't about a birthday surprise." I took a deep breath and laid out what I knew: the stolen intellectual property, the misleading presentations, careful to present it as concern rather than accusation. "I'm worried David has gotten himself into a situation that could have serious repercussions for him and possibly the company." Thomas's expression transformed from friendly to grave as I shared the evidence. "Jessica, these are extremely serious allegations." "I know. That's why I came directly to you, instead of going through formal channels first. I thought you deserved to know what might be coming." What I hadn't anticipated was Thomas's next revelation. "To be honest, there have been some financial irregularities we've been looking into. Expense reports that don't quite add up, project budgets with unusual allocations." He studied me carefully. "Would you be willing to share what you've found with our financial compliance team?" "Confidentially, of course." By the end of our meeting, the company had initiated a full investigation into both the intellectual property theft and potential financial impropriety. Thomas assured me they would be discreet until they verified the evidence. But the wheels were now in motion. Meanwhile, my own life was transforming in unexpected ways. The photography workshop I'd joined as part of my independence plan had awakened my dormant passion. My instructor, impressed with my eye for urban landscapes, invited me to contribute to a small gallery exhibition featuring emerging photographers. "These are remarkable, Jessica," she said, reviewing my portfolio. "You capture something most people miss: the dignity in overlooked spaces." The invitation included a 4-day trip to Olympic National Park with 3 other photographers, scheduled for the week after David's return. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, a legitimate reason to be away during the immediate aftermath of the confrontation I knew was coming. As David's trip progressed, his check-in calls became increasingly probing. What initially had been perfunctory "everything fine at home?" Questions evolved into more specific inquiries about mail, whether anyone had called for him, if I'd been in his office. "Why would I go in your office?" I asked innocently during one call. "You know I respect your private space." "No reason," he said quickly. "Just making sure everything's where I left it for when I return." His growing anxiety was palpable even across thousands of miles. During our final call before his return, he mentioned cutting the trip short by 2 days. "Is everything okay?" I asked, knowing full well it wasn't. "Some concerns at work," he said vaguely. Thomas has been sending cryptic emails about an urgent matter requiring my attention. How strange, I replied, suppressing the satisfaction of knowing exactly what those emails concerned. I'm sure it's nothing serious. Right, he said, clearly unconvinced. I'll see you tomorrow night instead of Thursday. The accelerated timeline meant scrambling to finalize preparations, but in some ways, it was a relief. The waiting had become its own kind of stress. I contacted Emma to move up our filing appointment and confirmed with Diane that she could come a day earlier than planned. By the time David's updated flight information showed him boarding his return flight, every piece of my plan was in place. The company investigation was actively underway, the divorce papers were prepared, and all evidence was secured. My separate bank account contained enough to support me for 3 months if needed, funded from our joint savings, taking only what was legitimately my portion. As I prepared our home for his return, straightening up, preparing a normal dinner as if nothing had changed, I reflected on his accusation that I was boring. Perhaps methodical was a better word. Thorough, patient. All qualities that had served me well in dismantling the elaborate deception he'd built around our marriage. David's key turned in the front door at 8:43 p.m., hours later than his scheduled arrival. I'd tracked his flight, knew he'd landed on time, and recognized the delay for what it was he'd been summoned to the office directly from the airport. I was sitting at our dining table, a simple pasta dinner kept warm in the oven, a glass of wine untouched beside my plate. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, not too formal to suggest I knew what was coming, but not so casual that I appeared vulnerable. The navy blue dress projected calm confidence. Jessica? His voice carried an edge I'd never heard before, fear poorly disguised as irritation. In here, I called, keeping my tone neutral. He appeared in the doorway, still in travel clothes, face haggard from the long flight and whatever had transpired afterward. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for clues, for changes. You're back early, I observed mildly. Hungry? I made pasta. Not hungry. He dropped his carry-on by the door, a breach of his own strict rules about keeping the dining area pristine. Have you been in my office? So that's where we were starting. No pretense, no easing in. Your office? No. Why? Because someone has been accessing my files, Jessica. Files only available through my home system. His voice rose slightly. And mysteriously, right when I'm halfway around the world, my entire career starts imploding. I took a deliberate sip of wine, maintaining eye contact. That sounds serious. What's happening at work? Like you don't know. He slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. Thomas pulled me into an emergency meeting the minute I landed. They're investigating me for, he stopped abruptly, reconsidering how much to reveal. For what, David? It doesn't matter. What matters is, someone has been feeding them information. And since I've been out of the country, that narrows down the possibilities considerably. The moment had arrived sooner than I'd planned, but I was ready. You're right, we should talk about possibilities. I stood slowly, walked to the sideboard, and retrieved a folder I'd prepared. Like the possibility that your wife would eventually discover your affairs. Or your hidden bank accounts. Or how you've been planning to leave me while systematically emptying our joint savings. His face went pale. You went through my private things? You spied on me? Interesting, that's your first concern. Not denying the affairs or the financial deception, just angry you got caught. I laid the folder on the table between us. Yes, David, I know everything. About Melissa. About the trips that weren't business. About the apartment you researched and the divorce lawyer you consulted. He switched tactics instantly, his expression softening into the charming, slightly apologetic look that had worked on me countless times before. Jess, listen, marriages go through rough patches. I was exploring options, that's all. Nothing was decided. Save it. I opened the folder, displaying printed copies of his messages with Melissa, bank statements showing transfers to his private accounts, and the consultation confirmation from the divorce attorney. You decided plenty. You just didn't have the decency to include me in those decisions. His eyes narrowed as he processed that his usual manipulations weren't working. Fine. Yes, I've been seeing Melissa. Yes, I've been planning an exit. Can you blame me? Look at our life together, it's stagnant. You're content with mediocrity. I want more. You mean you want what isn't yours? I met his gaze steadily. Like Miguel's intellectual property, that landed like a physical blow. David actually took a step back. What are you talking about? Miguel Santos, the consultant you interviewed last year who mysteriously didn't get hired after sharing his innovative project proposal. The same proposal you've been presenting as your own work for the past 6 months. That's ridiculous. I barely remember any consultant. David, stop. I've seen both presentations. They're practically identical. So has Miguel, by the way. And now, so has Thomas. The blood drained from his face. You went to Thomas? My boss? Are you trying to destroy me? I'm not trying to destroy anyone. I'm ensuring accountability for your choices. I kept my voice level despite my racing heart. You stole someone else's work. You betrayed our marriage. You hid assets and planned to discard me when it was convenient. His phone rang shrilly in his pocket, the specific ringtone he used for Melissa. The timing was almost comical. He silenced it without looking away from me. So that's your revenge? Ruining my career because I fell out of love with you? His voice hardened. That's pretty vindictive for someone who claims the moral high ground. This isn't about revenge, David. It's about truth. Something you've had very little interest in lately. I closed the folder and met his gaze directly. I'm not boring, by the way. I'm methodical. There's a difference. Boring people don't notice patterns. They don't connect dots. I did both. The doorbell interrupted whatever he was about to say next. Through the window, I could see Diane's rental car in our driveway. You called my mother? Disbelief colored his voice. What is this, an intervention? She deserved to know her son was planning to move to Singapore without telling anyone, including his wife. I moved toward the door. She's been worried about you, David. We both have been. Diane's presence changed the dynamic instantly. She'd always seen through David's performances in a way few others could. The three of us sat in the living room, an uncomfortable triangle of truth-telling. David? What's happened to you? Diane asked after I summarized the situation. This isn't how your father and I raised you. Please don't start with the disappointed parent routine, he snapped. I'm not 16. No. You're 36, which makes this behavior even more inexcusable. Her normally gentle voice carried an uncharacteristic edge. Cheating on your wife? Stealing another person's work? Hiding money? Your father pulled similar stunts before I finally left him, but at least he never stole intellectual property. The comparison to his father, a man David had always sworn he'd never emulate, struck a nerve. For the first time that evening, I glimpsed genuine shame beneath his defensive anger. As the evening progressed, David cycled through his repertoire of responses. Denial gave way to minimization, then to blame, shifting, followed by bargaining. When none worked, he finally resorted to desperate pleas. We can fix this, Jess. Couples therapy. A fresh start somewhere new. I placed the divorce papers on the coffee table between us. I've already signed my portion. You'll find everything is fair. I'm not asking for anything that isn't legally mine. In fact, I've been more generous than my lawyer advised. You can't be serious. He stared at the papers in disbelief. 7 years of marriage? And you're just walking away? No, David. You walked away a long time ago. I'm just making it official. And what about my job, my reputation? Did you think about that before you went running to Thomas? I thought about Miguel, whose work you stole. I thought about the company that employs you, which has policies against exactly what you did. And yes, I thought about you, about the person you used to be, who would have been appalled by this behavior. His final attempt at control came in the form of threats. If you go through with this, I'll make sure you get nothing. I have resources you don't know about. Connections? Actually, we've documented all your hidden resources, I interrupted calmly. And as for connections, you might find those changing rapidly given what's happening at work. Diane, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. David, enough. Sign the papers. Accept the consequences of your actions with some dignity. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once. He looked suddenly older, diminished. Taking the pen I offered, he signed the divorce agreement with a shaking hand. What will you do now? He asked, sounding genuinely curious for the first time. I allowed myself a small smile. I've been invited to show my photography in a gallery exhibition next month. Before that, I'm joining a nature photography expedition to Olympic National Park next week. His expression flickered with surprise, possibly even a hint of respect. Photography? You're serious about that? I've always been serious about it. You just weren't paying attention. I gathered the signed papers, sliding them into my folder. I suspect you'll be busy with the company investigation and finding new housing anyway. I'm keeping the house, it's part of our agreement. As Diane helped him gather some essential belongings to take to a hotel, the reality of his situation seemed to finally sink in. The comfortable life he'd built, much of it on deception, was collapsing around him. Yet, strangely, as he prepared to leave what had been our home, I felt no satisfaction in his distress, only a quiet certainty that justice, not revenge, had been served. At the door, he paused for a final question. Were you ever going to tell me you knew? Or were you just going to wait until I returned from Bali to spring this on me? Originally, I planned to wait until after you filed for divorce, to see how much you'd try to hide from me and the courts. I met his gaze steadily. But then I realized that would make me complicit in your deception. Some things need to be brought into the light, David. Even when it's painful. He nodded slowly, the gesture containing more genuine acknowledgement than anything else he'd offered that night. For what it's worth, he said quietly. You're right, you never were boring. That was just the easiest thing to say when the problem was really me. It wasn't an apology, but it was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. 1 month after that confrontation, I unlocked the door to my new apartment across town. Not our old house, despite having the right to keep it in the settlement. I'd decided to sell it and split the proceeds. Some spaces carry too many memories to allow for true reinvention. My new place was smaller but entirely mine, an urban loft with industrial windows perfect for natural light photography. The walls, once blank, now displayed my growing portfolio alongside artwork from local artists I'd befriended through the gallery community. The divorce proceedings had moved surprisingly quickly once David's professional situation deteriorated. The company investigation had confirmed both the intellectual property theft and financial impropriety he'd been skimming from project budgets, explaining his ability to fund his separate accounts and lavish gifts for Melissa. David had been terminated with cause, rendering his stock options and pending bonuses void. His professional reputation, once golden, was now tarnished in an industry that valued both innovation and integrity. The company had reached a settlement with Miguel, acknowledging his work and offering him a consulting position to properly develop his concepts. My own career path had taken an unexpected turn. What began as a workshop to reclaim my independence had blossomed into genuine professional opportunities. My photographs from Olympic National Park had been selected as the featured collection for the gallery exhibition, leading to commissioned work from 2 travel magazines interested in my perspective on overlooked urban landscapes. You have a remarkable ability to find dignity in neglected spaces, my mentor had commented during the exhibition opening. There's a respectful honesty in how you see the world. The irony wasn't lost on me. Qualities David had dismissed as boring were now being celebrated as my unique artistic vision. Diane had remained a steadfast presence in my life, choosing to maintain our relationship despite the divorce from her son. She'd visited twice since that night, helping me settle into the new apartment and offering the maternal support I'd missed since moving away from my own family for David's career. He was raised better than this, she'd said during her last visit, shaking her head. His father's influence, I suppose, always chasing some illusion of success instead of building something real. The financial settlement had been fair, giving me back what was rightfully mine from our years together. David had eventually stopped fighting once the evidence of his financial machinations became clear to the mediators. My lawyer Emma had been brilliantly thorough, ensuring that even accounts I hadn't discovered were included in the final agreement. David's attempts at reconciliation began about 2 weeks after he moved out. First, text messages expressing regret, then emails with increasingly desperate apologies. I responded politely but firmly, maintaining boundaries while acknowledging his communications. I wasn't interested in punishing him. His own choices had accomplished that effectively enough, but I also wasn't willing to re-engage in a relationship built on such fundamental betrayal. His professional downfall had been swift and comprehensive. Beyond losing his position at the company, he'd been quietly blacklisted within much of the industry. Thomas, his former boss, had reached out to me afterward. "I wanted to thank you for bringing this to our attention before it damaged the company more severely," he said over coffee, "and to let you know that we've implemented new protocols for verifying the origins of intellectual property presented by our executives." In a strange way, David's misconduct had created positive change beyond our immediate situation, a small comfort amid the wreckage of what had once been my life plan. The most surreal moment came 6 weeks after our separation, when I ran into David and his new girlfriend at a downtown restaurant. She was young, eager to please, laughing too loudly at his jokes, a reflection of who I had been in the early years of our relationship. The recognition was immediate and uncomfortable. He'd already found someone new to mold and eventually discard. When he stepped away to take a call, I approached her table briefly. "I don't know what he's told you about me or our marriage," I said gently. "But please be careful. Watch for patterns criticism that increases over time, financial secrecy, stories that don't quite add up." Her initial defensiveness softened slightly. "He said you grew apart, that you wanted different things." "That part's true, at least." I offered a small smile. "Just make sure you don't lose yourself trying to become what he wants." David returned before she could respond, his face tightening at finding me at their table. "Jessica, I see you've met Amber." "Just saying hello." I nodded politely to them both. "Enjoy your evening." My own healing journey hadn't been linear. Weekly therapy sessions helped me process the betrayal and rebuild my self-confidence. There were still days when grief ambushed me, not for the man David had become, but for the future I'd thought we were building together. For the years I'd invested in a relationship that had been slowly hollowing out beneath the surface. The exhibition's success led to an unexpected opportunity. A small publishing house specializing in arts and culture had approached me about creating a photography book focusing on urban dignity and overlooked beauty. The advance wouldn't make me wealthy, but it represented validation of my vision and the beginning of a legitimate career path I'd once abandoned for David's ambitions. The ultimate irony of David's boring accusation was that my life now contained more adventure and meaningful experiences than our relationship had for years. My work took me to different neighborhoods, cities, and natural settings. I'd made genuine friends in the arts community who valued my perspective rather than critiquing it. I'd even begun cautiously dating again, nothing serious yet, but enjoyable connections with people who found my photography passion fascinating rather than provincial. A recent coffee date with Michael, a literature professor who'd attended my exhibition, had left me feeling more intellectually engaged and personally seen than any interaction with David in our final years together. "What drew you to urban landscapes specifically?" he'd asked. Genuinely curious about my creative process, rather than dismissing it as a hobby. "I think there's honesty in spaces that aren't trying to impress anyone," I'd replied. "Beauty that exists without needing validation." 2 months after our separation, I received a text from David that differed from his previous attempts at reconciliation. "Just wanted you to know, I'm starting over. Small apartment. Entry-level position at a startup. Not what I planned, but maybe what I needed. I'm sorry for who I became with you." I didn't respond immediately, unsure what closure required in this situation. Eventually, I settled on simple honesty. "I hope you find your way to something authentic, David." The last I heard, he'd been demoted to a mid-level position at a smaller firm, his professional reputation requiring years to rebuild, if it ever could be. Melissa had ended their relationship shortly after his termination, unwilling to attach herself to his diminished prospects. As I arranged my photography equipment for tomorrow's shoot at an abandoned train yard, a commission for a national magazine's feature on industrial history, I reflected on how thoroughly my life had transformed in just a few months. The painful irony wasn't lost on me. David's cruel accusation had ultimately freed me to become more fully myself than I'd been in years. His attempt to diminish me had instead revealed my strength. The very qualities he'd dismissed as boring, my patience, attention to detail, methodical nature, had not only exposed his betrayal, but had become the foundation of my new career and independent life. Sometimes, I realized, someone's worst insult can become your greatest strength if you're willing to reclaim the parts of yourself you've been taught to devalue. If you're watching this and recognizing patterns from your own relationship, Remember that someone who truly loves you will never systematically belittle you or make you feel less than. Have you ever had someone underestimate you, only to later prove them wrong? Share your story in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear that being called boring might just mean you're thoughtful, thorough, and more perceptive than they ever gave you credit for. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, the best revenge isn't actually revenge at all. It's reclaiming your life and thriving on your own terms.